Canada is a huge country. In fact, it's the second largest country on Earth. It boasts amazing and beautiful cities full of culture. However, most of these are located near the US border. In fact, most Canadians lived on this southern border, and whilst the country is currently seeing itself battle a housing crisis with high buying and rental prices, it made me wonder, while the environment is definitely not ideal, why doesn't Canada invest in its northern territories and expand its cities up there? Looking at Alaska, for example, it has near 1 million people living in this huge northern giant, with its most populated city being Anchorage, and it almost has 300,000 people in it, which might not be a mega city, but still quite impressive for such a northern terrain. In comparison, Canada's most populated cities in its territories is Whitehorse, and it only has 24,000 people. So what gives? Why doesn't Canada build up north? If you enjoy this video and want to support me, make sure you like and subscribe, and let's get right into it. When it comes to the development of Canada's northern regions, it's a bit like we're moving in slow motion compared to other places, like the Faroe Islands. Even though they're tiny, they're making big economic strides. Here's the thing. We've got this vast expanse of land up north, but we're not really tapping into its potential. There aren't proper roads that can handle all weather conditions. The trains are falling apart and the ports aren't functioning well. Believe it or not, it's sometimes easier and cheaper to hop on a plane and go to Africa than to make your way up to places like Nunavut. Sure, we often hear that most Canadians live near the US border, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Think about it, cities like Regina are actually further south than some cities in Europe, like Amsterdam. Even Montreal is south of Venice. And if you were to transplant Toronto onto the Mediterranean coast, it would be rubbing elbows with the likes of Monaco. Now, while it's true that the folks in Milan might not be experts in handling a Canadian blizzard like the folks in Calgary, the fact remains that Canada may look huge on the map, but most of us are squeezed into a thin strip at the bottom. But let's talk about numbers. Only about 118,000 people call the northern parts of Canada home, which is just a tiny fraction of our entire population. Even if everyone in the Northwest Territories decided to catch a football game in Edmonton, there would still be thousands of empty seats in the stadium. And here's the kicker. Hardly anyone visits the northern parts of Canada. A study from 2011 found that only 14% of Canadians have ever set foot up there, and who can blame them? It's expensive and logistically challenging to get there. We've got one sluggish train chugging up north, and the roads are far from ideal. Despite the fact that it's been decades since the US built the Alaska Highway, we still don't have a reliable road network up there. To make matters worse, the only port in Churchill has shut down, so flying is pretty much your only option. But flights are infrequent and come with a hefty price tag. Want to fly from Toronto to Iqaluit? Be prepared to fork over more than $3,000. Meanwhile, you could jet off to destinations like Khartoum or Bangkok for a fraction of the cost. All of these obstacles add up, and it's no wonder that the northern parts of Canada remain underdeveloped. When you look at it from an economic standpoint, the northern regions contribute just a small fraction to our national GDP. But look at other Arctic countries like Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Even though they're much smaller than us, they've managed to build thriving economies up north. It's honestly a bit embarrassing. We've got so much potential up there, but we're not fully capitalizing on it. Unlike Russia, Greenland, Iceland, and all the other northern regions, Canada lacks a fishing industry. There are no ports for trawlers, and transportation to markets is non-existent. This lack of infrastructure also means there's no resource processing, which is common in other circumpolar regions. As a result, mining is the only significant industry sustaining Canada's small northern economy. While there has been much talk, particularly in southern Canada, about the mineral wealth of the Arctic, without a means to transport ores to market, well, these deposits are essentially worthless. Canadian mining companies are hesitant to invest, with only $250 million allocated for mineral exploration in Nunavut, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories combined. This amount is significantly less than what is being spent in Ontario alone. Additionally, the Conference Board predicts a decline in northern mining activities by 2020. Certain towns in the north rely on tourism. mainly from international visitors, as Canadians often prefer warmer destinations like Florida. This tourism industry is crucial, especially considering that a third of First Nation Canadians rely on selling arts and crafts to supplement their income. The lack of economic development has resulted in serious social issues. The unemployment rate in Nunavut is double the national average, while the Yukon's violent crime rate is 4 times higher. Nunavut's homicide rate is 9 times higher, and the Northwest Territories' incarceration rate is 10 times higher than in Ontario. Moreover, the inadequate health infrastructure exacerbates these problems. The infant mortality rate in the Canadian Arctic is twice that of Alaska and 7 times higher than in Iceland. Suicide rates among Inuit are 4 times higher than among Alaskan natives and 11 times higher than among southern Canadians. In the Yukon, life expectancy actually declined between 2000 and 2009. Canada's northern region is also largely undefended, with only 3 military bases and approximately 120 personnel stationed year-round. The area is vulnerable. The Royal Canadian Navy lacks ice-strengthened warships, unlike Denmark, which has 7. The Canadian Coast Guard has limited capacity, with only 8 icebreakers operating in the summer and fall, and none in thick ice. Marine traffic is monitored from Prescott, Ontario, a considerable distance from the Arctic. While the Canadian Rangers, a volunteer militia mainly composed of First Nation Canadians, provide surveillance and conduct sovereignty patrols, they lack adequate resources and equipment. They also rely on outdated gear and are often left to supply their own equipment, such as snowmobiles and radios, and despite their resilience, they can't fully substitute for a proper military presence in the Arctic. The northern regions of Canada remain largely undeveloped. Efforts to foster their growth were abandoned generations ago. Early generations harbored visions of unlocking the vast potential of our Arctic expanses. They expanded our borders northward, stretching over Hudson's Bay, beyond Baffin Island, all the way to the North Pole. And while jobs and mineral wealth lie waiting, they require infrastructure investments to be truly valuable. And with the changing climate opening up the Northwest Passage, Canada does have the opportunity to cultivate shipping routes and potentially establish a thriving commercial fishing industry. Failure to seize this opportunity could result in other nations taking advantage instead. However, somewhere along the line, we relinquish these ambitions. We settle comfortably into our armchairs, resigning ourselves to the status quo and declaring this is sufficient. And as we all know, to have a city that grows and that is actually sustainable, well, we need jobs, we need connections, and it can't cost a lot to bring stuff up. And well, this is the current situation in Canada. A big city in the northern Arctic regions is just not feasible. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem in a way. There's no real interest in founding new urban centers in the north, as it's far from civilization. There's no infrastructure, and there's just practically no job. Yet, you would need the infrastructure and jobs in place in order to convince people to move up that way. So in my opinion, unless we have some major change in our thinking and put in some real money up north, we won't see a northern city anytime soon. And aside from these socio-economic reasons, the north is extremely harsh, and itself would be challenged for everyone, and people moving up there would be expected to be compensated not lightly. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below, and at the same time you're there, you might as well like and subscribe. Let me know what you'd like to see next, and I'll see you on the next one.